Revolutions eat their own. It can be easy to imagine that after the war's over, that's when the killings stop, but usually that's just the beginning. How do you keep rebels united after the common enemy's gone? They usually don't have a struggle for leadership until there's a void, and that void comes when the war is over. A brotherhood in arms is only strong when they're brothers, when there is no father. Power corrupts, but inevitably somebody has to take power. There's a reason that lions eat their cubs. This is the story of a cub and the lion who ate him. It's a story of a man who died in Cuba at the hands of a friend, a brother in arms, a man named Fidel. I'm here because I believe the most important thing for free men to do is protect the freedom of others. I'm here because I believe that free men should take up arms and stand together and fight and destroy the groups and forces that want to take the rights of people away. These are the words of William Alexander Morgan, an American who fought for Cuban independence. But he was no hero. He was a drifter, a war deserter, a criminal, and an absentee father. He left no great impression on the world. He didn't even achieve his goals. He wasn't a great man, he was a broken man. But he found himself in Cuba, in revolution. At the very least, he fought for freedom. Or, that was the plan. The point of this video is not to tell his story or specifically talk about Fidel. I want to talk about freedom. In a certain respect, all 4 of our videos from Cuba are about freedom. Because beyond the buzzword and propaganda, it's a really hard concept to pin down, especially when you start to look at the bigger picture. Cuba as a nation has had a very troubled past. Slavery, colonization, imperialism, and uprisings have created a people who are rightly proud to say that they control their own destiny. Their leaders constantly speak of freedom and the desire to forever cast off the shackles of domination that Cuba has felt for so many generations. Every Cuban I've spoken to has said that they're free. But the way they frame their freedom to me says a lot about how it's been framed to them. They aren't talking about personal freedom, they're talking about national freedom. The island of Cuba is, was, and will likely always be of great geopolitical importance to the United States, and therefore of great importance to their enemies as well. It's a hard place to remain free. In the 1800s, American slavers invaded Cuba in an attempt to annex it like they'd done with Texas and California, hoping to shift the balance of political power in favor of the southern states. Military leaders wanted it because it meant total control of the Caribbean and reduced the danger of invasion from other major powers. Business leaders wanted it because it meant they could squeeze a nearby foreign population for cheap labor. Hundreds of prominent Americans have taken the position throughout history that Cuba will inevitably become part of the United States, whether they like it or not. Be it a state like Hawaii or protectorate like Puerto Rico, it should be theirs. And as an American, it might be hard to understand why that's a bad thing. After all, Cuba's a very poor country, and American domination would lead to greater wealth and greater personal freedom. And that's where we pick back up with the story of William Alexander Morgan and his executioner, Fidel. Morgan was an American, and even though he was at odds with his mother country, he fought for personal freedom. With his own band of rebels in the hills around Santiago, he joined forces with Fidel in the belief that they were united in their fight for parliamentary democracy, individual rights, and the destruction of dictatorial governance. After all, Fidel's movement only began when he wasn't allowed to run for office. His stated intent was removing the dictatorship of Fulgencio Batista and the corruption that had crippled his country. Morgan truly believed that his Cuban brothers in arms felt the same way he did. He couldn't understand that his view of the future was made hazy by an American frame of reference. It's almost as if he was blind to the idea that many people saw America as a looming beast on the horizon, in the same way that most of us don't see our countries that way. He saw them as a provider of freedom, not a threat to it. Yet, the example was there for him to see, if only he chose to see it. A generation before he began his struggle, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, Guam, and Cuba were all freed by the United States in their war with Spain. But when the dust had settled, 3 remained in American hands. Personally free, perhaps, but certainly not nationally. Only Cuba had managed to find their way out of the trap, and even then, Cuban independence was both tenuous and short-lived. Although many good Americans fought truly for Cuban freedom, they were undercut by politicians at home hell-bent on a new era of imperialism. At the end of the war, they demanded a naval base at Guantanamo on the principle that it would allow them to invade any time they felt Cuban security was being jeopardized. It was a threat packaged as a gift. Cubans saw it for what it was, but Americans for the most part didn't. For a time, it seemed like it might go either way. For a brief period after the war, Cubans had true independence, freedom as we would generally define the term. But slowly, piece by piece, that freedom was stripped away as American businesses entered the country. As was the case throughout modern history, any threat to foreign investment was met with foreign intervention. Through the corruption of local officials under the dictatorship of militarist Fulgencio Batista, Cubans lost everything: personal, political, and national freedom. Within a few decades, over 70% of the country's economic backbone, its farmland, would be owned by the United States. It would take the revolution of Fidel Castro to bring any of it back. William Alexander Morgan fought against Batista. He was willing to die to bring personal freedom back to the people. But what he failed to see was that in the eyes of the Cubans, there could be no long-term personal freedom until they had control over their national destiny. Without one, the other would always be in jeopardy. And in that haze, he failed to see the writing on the wall. Fidel never returned freedom to the people, but he did return freedom to the country. And for many, that was enough. His dictatorship would last longer than any in the history of Cuba. Despite repeated attempts from the United States to wrestle back control, the future was in Cuban hands, just not the people's hands. Rebellion is not a brotherhood. War is not glory. Revolution is often little more than sanctified murder. It's much easier to remove a dictatorship than it is to instill a democracy, because freedom is not a universal concept. Many Cubans today would tell you they're free, but it would be a hard sell to the rest of us. William Alexander Morgan fought, in his mind, for freedom. He believed the ends would justify the means. But I can only imagine, in his final moments, staring down the barrel of that firing squad that would take his life, he realized he'd made a mistake. He didn't fight for freedom. He fought for Fidel, and Fidel ate him. This is Rare Earth.
It's a verbo.
Perfecto. Gracias.